We're now 127 episodes into this podcast, and we've had some great guests and lots of illuminating dialogue. We've discussed ways to improve your overall health and well-being. We've certainly talked quite a bit about nutrition and exercise, and we've even touched on self-care and the importance of being your own healthcare advocate. But you know what we haven't talked much about? Mental health. I mean, we may have touched briefly on the subject in the past, but we've not really had a meaningful discussion about our mental health. My guest today defines mental health as the state of living with purpose, balance, contentment, and hope. And he wants to put the power of healing back in your control. Hello and welcome to the Over 50 Health and Wellness Show. I'm your host, Kevin English. I'm a certified personal trainer and nutrition coach, and my mission is to help you get into the best shape of your life, no matter your age, so you can show up in the second half of your life as the healthiest, strongest, most vital version of yourself. We have a great show for you today. Dr. Gregory Scott Brown is here, and he's going to give us some actionable self-care tips to help improve our mental health. But before we get to that, I want to let you know that this episode is brought to you by Ned. Ned makes the world's best natural remedies. They create effective natural treatments that serve as a holistic first line of defense against common ailments. Now, they make full-spectrum CBD products for general health, stress management, and sleep, as well as magnesium supplements for de-stressing and sleep support. And let me tell you, I am a huge fan of their magnesium product. It's called Mellow, and I use it every evening. It helps me de-stress. It optimizes my sleep. But I gotta say, I also love their CBD body butter on sore muscles and achy joints. Anyway, if you're interested in learning more, head over to silveredgepartners.com and click on the Ned icon. And because you're a listener of the show, you can save 15% off your first order when you use the coupon code SILVEREDGE at checkout. So that's silveredgepartners.com, and that coupon code again is SILVEREDGE. That's SILVEREDGE all run together with no spaces. Okay, enough of that. Let's get on with today's show. My guest today is Dr. Gregory Scott Brown. Dr. Brown is an integrative psychiatrist, a husband, a wellness advocate, a columnist for Men's Health magazine, and he's the author of the new book titled The Self-Healing Mind, an essential 5-step practice for overcoming anxiety and depression and revitalizing your life. In this episode, Dr. Brown shares his own struggles with mental health, as well as some practical tips that we can all apply to our lives right now to help improve our mental health. I started our interview by asking Dr. Brown to share his own personal story of his struggles with his own mental health.
So one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this topic is that even though I'm a psychiatrist, when I was in my early 20s, I actually struggled with depression. It was a time of transition for me, like it is for so many people that age, but I didn't necessarily know what it was. I didn't have a name for it. And I think one of the worst things that I did during that time is I didn't really talk about it. I wasn't talking to my family or my friends about it. I was suffering in silence. And so my work today really focuses on improving the way we think and talk about mental health. And that's why I wrote the book, so that as many people can have access to these tools and skills as possible.
Okay, so you yourself suffered from, you said depression, right? And some mental health issues in your 20s, and that's probably more common than people think. And why do you think it is that so many of us are so hesitant to reach out for help when it comes to mental health?
I think there's still a lot of stigma around it. I mean, I think that that's something we're obviously, moving beyond these days. I think, the fact that we're having this conversation today and so many others are having conversations about mental health and mental illness on social media, on television, writing articles about it. We're seeing celebrities and influencers actually coming out and talking about their personal struggles. But it's still something that we have to come to terms with. How do we overcome the stigma that's associated with it?
Yeah, so there does seem to be a stigma associated with mental health. And I agree. I do think that that's changing just from a lay person's perspective, and hopefully and rightfully so. But before we go a whole lot further, let's try and define this. When you say mental health, what are we talking about when we say mental health?
So that's a great question, because the thing is, when most people think about mental health, when I ask most people, what do you think about? Usually they'll start saying things like depression, anxiety, ADHD. They'll list clinical diagnoses, right? Or they'll talk about topics like suicide. Now, these are really important things to talk about. And that's definitely a part of, what we think about when we're talking about mental illness. But, if you imagine someone like me when I was in my 20s who hadn't necessarily been diagnosed officially with depression or necessarily considered suicide in explicit terms, it might be easy for me to brush aside this whole conversation of mental health if that's how I'm defining it. I might think, okay, well, mental health is not really something that I can resonate with. So a definition I offer in the book is that we should all consider mental health as the state of living with purpose, balance, contentment, and hope, because it's a broader definition, it's more inclusive, and that applies to the billions of people on the planet, regardless of whether or not you've been diagnosed with a mental illness.
So I love the way you say that. You say that mental health is, if we're living with purpose, balance, contentment, and hope.
That's
then
right.
If we have those things, then probably we are not going down the path of mental illness. But a lot of us, I think, when we think of mental illness, certainly depression, maybe schizophrenia, and a lot of anxiety. And talk to us a little bit about the increase, or I'm just assuming there's been an increase in mental health. And certainly there has been in depression, anxiety in these last couple of years, right? We've had some political tumultuous times. We've had this whole COVID thing, and that's kind of still ongoing and lingering. And I would imagine that creates an environment that's ripe to have this mental illness, right? Or
right. And I think that's why it's important that we broaden the definition of it, right? Because you got that right on the nose during the height of COVID. A lot of people were noticing that they felt more isolated. We weren't going, we weren't associating with our friends and our family as much in person. People may, just feel like kind of disconnected, even though they weren't necessarily meeting with a psychiatrist or taking medications for depression. They noticed that the pandemic definitely took a toll on the way that they felt. And so again, when I talk about mental health, I'm also talking about that as well, right? And so mental health is really the driving force that determines how we live and work and interact with each other and love and connect. It affects all of those things, and we need to keep that in mind.
Okay, so in your book, I've read that you say that mental health begins with actionable self-care. Mm-hmm. So now that we kind of have a bucket for what healthy mental health looks like, let's talk about actionable self-care. What do you mean when you say self-care?
So what I mean is, oftentimes when people think about how do you work on your mental health, they think, okay, I need to go to therapy. I need to meet with a psychiatrist, right? Maybe take a medication for anxiety or medication to help me sleep. And the self-care component is often what's missed. It's something that many of us just take for granted. And so what I mean by actionable self-care is focusing on evidence-based strategies that can optimize mental health, that can move us closer to living that full, rich life. Now, in the book, I outline 5 essential pillars for self-care: sleep, spirituality, nutrition, breath work, and movement. And I think when we all learn how to utilize these strategies the right way, in a way that is conducive with evidence, we can really move closer to living a life with mental health.
Okay, I'm 100% with you on there. I'm excited to get to that. Let's put a pin in those 5 pillars a minute, because we're definitely going to come back to those and pick those apart a little bit. But just sticking with the mental illness here. So we've defined mental illness and what mental health looks like. We've defined self-care, and it sounds like you're saying, hey, there are things that are in our control that we can all take responsibility for that will positively impact our mental health. But going back to the mental illness, how do we diagnose mental illness? So you're a psychiatrist. If I walk into you, do I lay down on a couch and you break out a notepad and ask me about my dreams? How are you diagnosing mental health these days?
So, I mean, that's a really good question. Let me just back up, a couple of steps here. So if we're talking about mental illness, these diagnosable conditions like generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, it's also important to realize that millions of people in the United States do struggle or meet the threshold for those clinical diagnoses. 40 million plus Americans in a given year would meet criteria for an anxiety disorder. Tens of millions of Americans in a given year would meet criteria for depression. And these are people, young and old, of all ages, racial and ethnic backgrounds. In the United States, there are over 130 suicides on average every single day, right? And so it's important that, if you're listening to this and you feel like you might be struggling with a mental illness, or you feel like, anxiety or depression is really getting in the way of your life and preventing you from doing the things that you want to do, picking up the phone, touching base with a therapist or a psychiatrist who would be able to make that diagnosis would be the next best step. I mean, if anything, just talk to someone around you, whether it's your husband, your wife, a friend, let them know how you're feeling. Don't suffer in silence.
Yeah, don't suffer in silence. And clearly, we're going to make this distinction, I guess, between I want to make a distinction. You tell me, maybe it's an artificial distinction, but between a diagnosable mental illness and then just more mental health. Is it fair to say that it's probably a spectrum, right? But either way, we're going to discuss these 5 pillars. I'm going to imagine they would help folks even if you have a diagnosable mental illness, or if you're just suffering from just mild depression, mild anxiety, things that probably all of us experience to some extent. Is that fair?
That's fair. I mean, and the thing that we want to focus on, it is a spectrum that's evolving, but the thing that we really want to focus on when we're talking about a clinical diagnosis is the level of functional impairment. And that's just a fancy way of us talking about, okay, everyone has anxiety. All of us have anxiety. We need anxiety in order to survive. If there's a threat, right, and we're not anxious, we're going to succumb to the threat, right? And so anxiety, in a sense, is inherent. It's not necessarily bad. Now, if anxiety is crippling, if it's causing functional impairment in your life, if it's preventing you from being able to have a conversation with a friend or interact with people in your environment, or if it's causing you to feel worn down and tired every single day, right? That would indicate a functional impairment and might suggest that, hey, it's time to then go and pick up the phone and meet with a mental health professional. Now, I just want to caveat that by saying that, we're learning more about the fact that some people do have high functioning, quote unquote, high functioning depression, high functioning anxiety, which isn't necessarily a clinical diagnosis, but even though they're feeling depressed or anxious, they're still somehow able to muster up the energy to get up and do what they need to do and force a smile, and I think that in those cases, it's really important that you're honest with yourself, right, about what's going on. And if you're in the gray area, if you're thinking, I'm not really sure if I'm at the level of a clinical diagnosis or not, then talk to someone. I mean, that's really the first thing you can do and the best thing that you can do.
Okay, and we've heard that advice from you here just in these few short minutes a couple times already. So folks out there,
it's that important, right?
If you're hearing this and you're thinking, that sounds like me, that may be describing me. Clearly, Dr. Brown said we've all got some level of anxiety and depression. We all live in the real world and we live in these times right now, so that's probably inevitable. But if you feel like you may be high functioning in spite of that, or if you feel like it's impairing your life, it may be time to talk to somebody. So let's pull apart the talk to somebody. Clearly, I mean, ideally, we would come in and talk to somebody like you, right? But for just the average person listening, what is their best avenue? Is it best to talk to a loved one? How does one reach out to a mental health professional? And how do we overcome maybe even that stigma, especially those of us over 50, maybe we may have, that may be more of a stigmifying event in our life than, say, a younger person coming up who's maybe a little more comfortable having these kinds of discussions. What are some steps we can take if somebody's listening to this thinking, I've been dealing with this for a long time and it is affecting my life?
So I'm going to steal some advice here from Kevin Hines, who's a remarkable gentleman that I interviewed for the book. Now, Kevin, I share a story in the book. Kevin, when he was in his late teens, early 20s, struggling with bipolar disorder and actually attempted suicide by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And miraculously, he survived. And Kevin is just fired up these days about, traveling around the country, traveling around the world, working as a suicide prevention activist. And something he said to me the first time I spoke to him was that if he had to give anyone a piece of advice, it would be talk to someone, anyone, right? And so, if I'm sitting here saying, the person you should talk to has to have an MD behind their name, or they have to be the person that you're married to, I think let's be frank. I mean, sometimes those conversations don't go the way you expected them to go. I mean, sometimes you'll tell your spouse and you'll feel that your spouse, someone you've been married to for decades, is not validating your experience, right? Sometimes people meet with a psychiatrist and don't necessarily make that personal connection the first visit. I'll tell you, I definitely didn't back when I was struggling. Keep moving. I mean, keep talking, and eventually you'll find someone that you connect with. At the very least, it could improve your life, and, it might even save it.
100%. I agree with you. And I'll encourage folks this. I'll go ahead and share here. I struggle with some depression and some mental health issues in my 20s, similar to you. And it was a loved one who intervened on my behalf. So folks listening to this, if you see these signs in someone else, maybe you being the person that has that conversation. In my case, it was my sister who invited me to lunch with her and a friend. Well, I was hoodwinked. I was tricked. Her friend was a psychiatrist, and I'm at the table having lunch, and all of a sudden I'm getting this weird vibe from this person I've never met. And she seems to be repeating things back to me, and she seems to be asking these very probing questions. And I didn't realize what was happening at the time. Now I went on to have a very successful relationship with this therapist. But in my case, what I was outwardly showing was substance abuse, but it turns out that was not so much my cause as it was the symptom for me, right? That's just, I had some things I was working through. But I would encourage folks, if you're feeling this yourself, or if you're sensing this in another, I guess reaching out and having communication is the first step, is what I hear you saying, right?
Right. And for me, similar to you, I mean, it wasn't therapists, but one of the first people I talked to about my experience was a cousin of mine, right? Who drove down from Dallas. I mean, suspected something was going on with me, and she was there, made herself available to me. And, I'm so grateful for that. I mean, many, many years later. But again, there's no recipe for who that person is you should talk to, right? As long as you're talking to someone.
Okay. So there you go, folks. We've heard that multiple times now. Talk to someone. Okay. Moving right along here, you make a distinction that I thought was pretty interesting. You talk about in the book the difference between the brain and the mind. And I think the way you put it is biology gives us a brain, but our life gives us our mind, or something along those lines. And that may have been a quote that you pulled. That's
a quote from Jeffrey Eugenides, one of my favorite writers.
Oh, that's right.
I mean, I think he said that so beautifully, right?
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting that. So talk to us about because I think a lot of people may either think of those two things synonymously or just not giving that any thought, right? The difference between the brain and the mind.
Right. And, and I'll be transparent here. This is not an area where all psychiatrists or all mental health professionals agree. I mean, there's some psychiatrists out there who sell a lot of books and essentially make a living off of, suggesting that, mental illness is just a matter of, brain health, right? And so, I can tell you that, there's not necessarily a part of the brain that you can point to and say, this is the part that's responsible for sadness, and this is the part of the brain that's responsible for depression or anxiety. I mean, we know a little bit about networks and neurotransmitters, but it's still a field that we're learning so much about. And so I think that the mind, we're talking about the mind, it's everything we don't know about the brain. It's that mysterious substance that can influence things like love, right? And really determine what makes us happy and content, those life experiences that are so important. So Again, I mean, when we're talking about mental health, it's important to realize that there's not necessarily a quick pill fix or a brain scan that can really determine these things. It's so much more than that.
It does seem to be nuanced and complex and complicated, right? And it's not as easy as saying, oh, well, there's this neurotransmitter, and if we block it with this XYZ pharmaceutical, then you'll be quote unquote well. It's more than that. And I love the way that it seems to me that we have this brain chemistry, and we're learning more about that as obviously day by day. But it seems to me that when you separate the brain and the mind, and you talk about the mind, when we get to the mental health part, that living with purpose, balance, contentment, and hope, and you mentioned love, it seems to me those might be more of a function of the mind than the brain. Certainly there's the brain as a biological organ has got to be an important component of that. But there is,
imagine if we could take a pill that would allow us to feel loved, right?
Yeah, right.
I mean, or imagine if there were a procedure that could induce happiness. I mean, we'd all go and get that procedure, and we'd all go and take that pill, right? And I think this is just an important point to make here, because I have so many patients who come to me, even though they know I'm an integrative psychiatrist and they're familiar with my work, and still there's this idea of, Doc, I think I have a chemical imbalance. Can you give me a pill to fix it, right? And we have to spend some time kind of like, explaining that that's not how the mind works. So it's really important to make that distinction.
And before we go any further, so you just refer to yourself as an integrative psychiatrist. Let's pick that apart a little bit. Talk about what is an integrative psychiatrist?
So I actually spent, time after my general psychiatry residency getting a fellowship in integrative psychiatry, where I learned about evidence-based practices for optimizing nutrition. I learned about supplements. I learned about the role of exercise and movement for mental health. And so most integrative psychiatrists would take a comprehensive approach to treating mental illness. Now, it does not by any means mean that we disavow medications or therapies. In fact, I prescribe medications every week in my clinic. I am a staunch advocate for therapy. Those are evidence-based strategies as well. But it also means that we're not sweeping other evidence-based strategies like nutrition and movement and spirituality under the rug. So it's more of a comprehensive approach.
And I love the way that medicine seems to be moving in that direction. And of course, I live in this health and wellness sphere. So most of the input that I'm getting in the information I'm actively seeking would have a bias towards me finding that kind of information. But it does seem that there's this new wave of taking accountability for our health and being our own doctor, so to speak. And we're getting ready to talk a lot about that in this case with your 5 pillars here of self-care. That does seem to be a movement in medicine that I think is very empowering for people, right? As opposed to, I go to the doctor because I have this symptom, so I get this pill that treats that symptom, and that does relieve that symptom, but I have to keep coming back because we haven't gotten to that root cause. We haven't looked at this problem as a whole. And I love that direction. So, Dr. Brown, before we get into these 5 pillars, one other thing I wanted to touch on, you wrote considerably in your book on resiliency. And I'd like for you just to take a minute and talk about resiliency and its relationship to self-care and mental health.
Well, it goes back to that genetic model of the brain that we were talking about a little bit earlier. I mean, some people may think, oh, well, my parents had anxiety, my sister is depressed, and so this is just how I am, right? I don't have any control over my life, right? And the idea of, and now I should say that there are heritable components to depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses, but we have more control than we think we do, right? And studies actually support this idea. I mean, we're talking about resilience. We're talking about things like active coping, right? Coming up with concrete steps forward. Like, how are we going to navigate the challenges in front of us? I mean, I think I may have shared this in the book. It's like, if someone enjoys playing basketball and they're 5'8" like me, right? You can't play center maybe, but you could still enjoy a pickup game of basketball, maybe as a point guard, right? So it's not to say that our genetics totally determine the outcome of our life. It's a number of factors that play a role.
Yeah, and I think that epigenetics is also having its day right now, where we're learning that while, yes, you may be genetically predisposed to some particular condition, our environment plays a huge role in that, and that part is under our control. And so focusing on the things that we can control, I suppose that would be a very healthy mental health component as well as concentrating on the things that we can control. Yeah.
I mean, and it's like me. So when I was in my early 20s, I mentioned I struggled with depression. And even, many decades later, I mean, it's something that I experienced back then. Maybe, my genetics predisposed me to that, but I have to pay attention to it. I mean, depression can recur, right? And, I've shared this on other shows. There are those days and weeks still where, I'll feel that dark cloud hanging over my head and it's like, am I slipping into this again? Right. And so that's when I really have to be cognizant about tapping into these self-care strategies. And, there are many people out there have never struggled with depression and never will. Right. And so that's an example, I think, of how someone can actually tap into resiliency and utilize it to their advantage when it comes to mental health.
100%. And so people might be surprised to hear you say that. You said, yeah, I struggle with some depression issues in my 20s, and now I'm a psychiatrist. They're probably thinking, well, you're cured. Because now you have the answer. And here you are telling us, here I am years later, and I can still feel this coming on. We just talked about resiliency, and I'm not sure if this is where you put it in the book, but you talk about feeding the two wolves. So folks that aren't familiar with feeding two wolves, why don't you talk to us about that story and how it applies to, say, when you feel depression coming on, or when anybody has kind of this negative.
Well, it's all about positive psychology, right? And so if we feed negative thoughts, I mean, that's how we're going to feel. Right? If we feed positivity, if we feed light and hope and, feeding the good wolf, right? I mean, that's the way we're going to feel, right? And so the thing is, we have to be intentional about it. I mean, life is not going to just show up and hand us a plate of happiness and contentment, right? I mean, these are things that we really have to be fired up about. We have to be intentional about finding those things. And when we really do that, I mean, it makes a world of difference in the way that we feel.
It certainly does. Yes. I love the way you talk about the intentionality. And I think that's a perfect segue into talking about your 5 pillars of self-care. And you had mentioned them earlier. It was breath and sleep and your spiritual self, nutrition and movement. So let's start with, I think you start in the book. It's bringing attention to your breath. You talk about your breath as medicine. So talk to us about the importance of our breath, because most of us are probably thinking, well, yeah, I breathe without thinking about it.
So I'll share a story. When I was in training, I was covering an inpatient unit one weekend. I got a call from one of the nurses who told me, Dr. Brown, we have an elderly woman down here in the unit who just got here and she's extremely anxious. Can you write a script for 1 milligram of Ativan? So Ativan's a benzodiazepine medication that can quickly alleviate anxiety. And I think many docs in that situation would just say, yeah, give her the medication. It's fine, right? What I did that day, again, I was just starting to learn some of these skills that I speak about in the book. I'm like, let me go down and see how she's doing, sit with her, and let's do some 4-7-8 breathing together, right? And so I sat with this elderly woman the bedside. She was extremely anxious. And we together, I did it with her. Inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. And I'm telling you, after about 2 or 3 minutes, I asked her how she felt. She had stopped trembling. There was a sense of calm and peace, and she didn't need the Ativan, right? And the thing is, it was only a couple of minutes. The effect was very fast, right? And so the science behind 4-7-8 breathing is that longer exhale component is really important because that activates something called the parasympathetic nervous system, which can lower your heart rate. It can increase GABA activity in the brain. So GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that can be great for anxiety. And also, if you were to monitor brain waves, it increases the presence of something called alpha activity, alpha waves, which are a physiologic marker of rest and relaxation. So We take between 20 and 30,000 breaths every single day. And again, it is one of the most underutilized forms of medicine if we know how to take advantage of our breath.
I'm 100% with you. And I use a very similar practice myself. Oftentimes when I feel overwhelmed or anxious, I've just gotten into this habit of that very intentional breathing. And yeah, that 4-7-8. And I don't do that exactly, but to your point, getting out of that sympathetic nervous system into that parasympathetic, that rest and digest state. The important part is that slow exhalation. It's going to be longer than the inhalation. And you're right. It can immediately lower anxiety and tension. And it's amazing. It is a medicine, right? To your point, you had this woman who's trembling, and within moments, the ask was for a pharmaceutical, but within moments of something as simple as breathing, this patient was then calmed down. So you have a self-care playbook for each of your 5 pillars. Clearly, that 4-7-8 breathing technique is one. Are there other breathing techniques that you suggest folks use to kind of calm the mind and the body?
So there's several that I outline in the book. I think the biggest mistake people make with breath work is that they're not breathing in a way that is necessarily supported by science. Someone might think, okay, I breathe these tens of thousands of times every day. Why am I not like perpetually in a state of Zen, right? But the thing to keep in mind, again, the 4-7-8, the longer exhale component, there's another technique I talk about in the book, has a fancy Sanskrit name called Ujjayi Pranayama, right? And that's commonly taught in a yoga class, right? So in yoga, breath is very important. And so what's going on with Ujjayi Pranayama breath is that you are compressing the glottis, the back of your throat, kind of inhaling and exhaling with some compression, as if you're over a water hose, right? And what that compression does is some studies can indicate that it creates a slight compression on the vagus nerves, which are these 2 long nerves that run down the bilateral sides of the neck. And that's another effective way of activating the parasympathetic nervous system. So again, it's learning how to manipulate breath in a way that the body has no choice but to respond. I mean, that's how we're wired.
Okay, so there's our first pillar, is bringing attention to breath. And you mentioned breathing supported by science. I'm guessing that made more than one eyebrow kind of raising. Breathing supported by science.
Yeah.
Is it all breathing supported by science? No, but so a couple of great tips there. And certainly anybody that's been to a yoga class, and that's that kind of almost seashore sounding intentional breathing that you're referring to.
That's absolutely right.
And of course, very relaxing and brings that attention back inward. Now, your second pillar here is one of my favorite topics, and we talk about this a lot on the show, and it's the sleep solution. Let's talk about sleep and its relationship, because I talk a lot about sleep and its relationship to physical health. Let's talk about sleep and its relationship to mental health.
So sleep and mental health have a bidirectional relationship. So if we're not sleeping well, it can take a toll on mental health, right? And if we are overworked or burned out or depressed or anxious, it can affect our sleep quality. Now, some of the important things to consider is something called sleep hygiene, right? And that really means, so if we are, napping during the day, right? If we are exercising at night, if we're sleeping in a room that's just too warm. So studies have shown that it's better to sleep in a cooler room than a warmer room if you're really wanting to improve your sleep quality. Something that many of us struggle with is screen time, right? Spending too much time on the laptop, on the computer. And that's something that I've noticed kind of went up, especially during COVID when we're not out as much. I mean, we're talking to our relatives and our friends on Zoom. And so the reason why that's important is because blue and green wavelengths of light that are emitted from our tablets and smartphones can actually block or hinder the release of melatonin, which is a hormone that's involved in helping us fall asleep. So, these are simple things that we need to pay attention to, and simple things that we can actually modify that don't cost anything, right? That might then improve our sleep quality and in turn improve our mental health.
100% with you there. Yeah, I think that you're right that the screen time right before bed is a big one. We talk a lot about that here on the show as well. And I'll get people say, yeah, well, what about if I wear blue blocker glasses? And I suppose that's a little better, but what are you using your screen for right before bed? Are you getting triggered? Are you getting worked up? Are you reading the news? Are you, scrolling through social media posts that are inflammatory? That's not helping your sleep. And of course, a nice, cool, dark room. You'd already mentioned that. I love the idea of set bed and wake times throughout the week. So most of us do a pretty good job of that on the weekday, but then we have a whole different sleep pattern for the weekends, and that's going to throw off your circadian rhythm. Now, before we leave sleep, talk to us a little bit. So folks that may have sleep issues, maybe insomnia type thing, may be thinking more like, well, what about Ambien or whatever the latest and greatest sleep pharmaceuticals are? Where do they play a role here in sleep and mental health?
So, it doesn't really get to the underlying cause, right? And I think it's important that, again, sleep quality is what we're looking for. So a psychiatrist or any sleep specialist will actually be able to, analyze the sleep architecture, look at how much REM sleep you're getting, non-REM sleep, N1, N2, N3 stages of sleep, right? And, if you're using substances, whether it's, Ambien or alcohol to put you to sleep, that can definitely affect your sleep architecture, even though you feel like you are getting sleep, right? And so I'd say, it's best if we can take control of the modifiable factors first, right? But if there's an underlying condition, obstructive sleep apnea, or something else, there are medications that I prescribe and that other physicians prescribe that can help.
100%. Yeah, I agree. I think that especially say alcohol, a lot of people are self-medicating with alcohol, maybe more so now in the last couple of years than usual. We've had a long, stressful day. We'll unwind with a drink. And right before bed, while that may be true that it helps you fall asleep, it does not help you have healthy sleep. It does the exact opposite. It is effectively.
So alcohol is tricky for a lot of people, right? And so the thing about alcohol, and again, I'm not saying that you can't ever drink alcohol. There are some studies indicating that, an occasional glass of wine can have health benefits, right? But again, if you find that you're relying on alcohol every night to put you to sleep, right? Alcohol can actually, shake up sleep architecture in a way that is not beneficial for your overall health. Even though you feel like you're falling asleep, you're not going through the stages of sleep as you would if you weren't drinking alcohol. So that's important to keep in mind.
Right. Those REM cycles, those deep sleep cycles that you had referenced earlier, that's the restorative phase of sleep. And that's when you're saying disrupting the architecture, that's what's being disrupted. And we want to maximize those restorative phases of sleep, and things like alcohol and I guess pharmaceuticals are going to detract from that. All right. So your next chapter is one I haven't really addressed much on this show, just peripherally, I suppose, but it's very important to me personally. And that's tapping into your spiritual self. And this was, I think, another one of your quotes here before your chapter. It says, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. Rather, we're spiritual beings having a human experience. So talk to us about what do you mean when you say tapping into your spiritual self, and how does that tie into our mental health?
What's interesting is that I've had thousands of clinical conversations with patients over the years. And I have never asked a patient, is spirituality important for mental health? And the patient told me no. It's never happened, regardless of whether or not the person, is religious. And so it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about spirituality. A lot of people do think about religion, but religion is just one of many forms of spirituality. So spirituality is all about connection, whether that's connecting to your inner self through something like meditation, connecting with your external environment through something like altruism, volunteering your time, selfless service, or if you do happen to be religious, connecting with the higher power through prayer. What that connection does is it shifts the focus from us, and it can allow us to appreciate that there is a greater purpose for our life, whether that purpose is to be the best parent or grandparent, alive, or to be the best son or daughter, or to just, really connect with our inner self. I mean, it's something that I think that we shouldn't take for granted. Now, science behind that is, I'll tell you, there have been some studies that have indicated that people who are able to tap into their spiritual self are able to quiet or reduce activity in an area of the brain called the default mode network, which tends to be overly active in people who were perpetually stressed and burned out and anxious. And so, again, it can help long-term with reducing anxiety and instilling that sense of calm, peace, and contentment.
Yeah, it's been my personal experience. I personally have a short prayer meditation practice that's right before I go to bed. I pray several times during the day, but I have this specific, and it's basically a gratitude. If you don't want to frame it as a prayer, it's a gratitude practice then, but it's very calming to me, and it's become ritualized. It's the last thing I do before I fall asleep. And so it's kind of a part of my sleep hygiene as well. But it's the last thoughts going through my head are giving thanks and in this place of gratitude and love. And it just sets me up for, I suppose, healthy sleep. And it ends my day no matter how stressful my day or whatever happened in my day. It could have been the worst day of my life or the best day of my life. We always have that consistent. And like I said, it's comforting to me, and it's become just a part of what I do. And it's, I suppose, very important to my mental health. And I hadn't, until I was reading through this chapter of your book, I hadn't really couched it in those terms, connecting with the mental health. Of course, I'm always thinking, well, I want to optimize my physical performance here, and I want to be the most optimized biological machine I can be as I age. But certainly my mental health is a critical component of all of that, right?
Right. And we're all here for a reason, right? And it's important that we keep that in mind. I mean, one of the statistics that, I didn't mention earlier is that, specifically among men, some of the highest rates of suicide occur, in older men, as men get older, right? And oftentimes they can lose that sense of purpose, and they can lose that sense of hope. Even if they're not meeting with a psychiatrist or they haven't been diagnosed, they might think, okay, I've lived my life. My best days are behind me, right? But if you're here, that's just not the case, right? I mean, when it's our time, it'll be our time. But if we're here, we have a purpose. And it's important that, all of us, regardless of how old we are, that we, keep that in mind.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about purpose on a couple of these episodes a while back. And one of the ways we were expressing it is just really finding your passion, what lights you up, and sharing that with others. It doesn't have to be anything more complex than that, right? Just what are you passionate about? What do you love? And how can you manifest that more in your life? How can you share that with others? Something as simple as that can give you purpose. And I hadn't thought about that people as they get older, especially older men, are losing their purpose and feeling their best days are behind them. And that's what this podcast rails against. I'm actively saying, no, that's the common narrative, but it doesn't have to be your reality, right?
And if you don't know what your purpose is, because when I ask patients that, a lot of times they'll say, well, doc, I don't know. I don't know what gets me fired up, right?
Yeah.
Get fired up about searching for what that thing is, right? Sure. I mean, knowing that you're going to find it, the quest, the prize is in the process. So really focus on that. And, that can make a world of difference as well.
Yeah, the prize is in the process. I love that you're gonna finish this up with that, and the journey, right? It's all about the journey. Well, before we leave spirituality, the self-care playbook here, you talk about accessing your spirituality. What are some tips we can give people to really tap into this, for folks that maybe have put spirituality, that's religion, and I had a bad experience with that, so that's not me. What are some ways that people might be able to connect with their spiritual selves?
I think meditation is a great place to start, right? And there's so many benefits from meditation. I mean, there are multiple sections of the book that I could have included meditation in. But what's important to keep in mind is you don't have to be a Buddhist monk or join a fancy meditation spa in order to do this. And that's often the message that gets portrayed, on podcasts and on social media. And so I want to debunk that myth right here. I mean, anyone can practice meditation, and all you have to do to get started, find a quiet space, right? You can either sit down, you can lie down if you need to, draw your attention to your breath. Close your eyes, sometimes focusing on a mantra that is meaningful for you. I am kind, I am loved. I mean, whatever your personal mantra is, and try it out for 2 or 3 minutes when you're just getting started. See how you feel afterwards. And it might be something that really catches fire. You might notice, okay, this is something that I really need to do every single day because it makes me feel so much better, right? So that's a great place to start.
I'm with you 100%. I love that. And I love that you mentioned that to start 2 to 3 minutes. I mean, we're not talking about an hour long of Om. We're talking about just centering yourself and finding your breath. And I love tracking things. I personally wear a Whoop band. It's a bio tracker, and it does a decent job of my recording my REM cycles and my deep sleep cycles. And I have noticed that periods when I consistently meditate, even 5 minutes in the morning, has an impact on my sleep cycles, a positive impact. And when I don't start my mornings that way, it has a slightly negative impact. So it's interesting how something that I do for 5 minutes, before 6 a.m. in the morning could possibly affect what happens when I go to sleep that night, but consistently done, and it certainly does.
And I think that type of biofeedback is great, especially for people who are skeptical about it, to be able to look at a Fitbit or an Oura Ring or a Whoop band and say, hey, look, my heart rate just dropped.
My HRV this month was better because I meditated this month. And okay, let me not do it next month. Oh, guess what happened? That's right. The self-experimentation that we can do with this information now is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
100%. All right. So we got 2 more pillars to go and a couple that I really, really love talking about. I could nerd out on nutrition all day long. So your fourth pillar is the medicine on your plate. Talk to us about nutrition and food. And I talk about this all the time, and mostly I'm talking about it for its biological benefit on our physical health. Talk to us about mental health and nutrition.
So we're learning more as a scientific community about the fact that the food that we eat not only plays a role in our physical health, but in our mental health as well, particularly anti-inflammatory foods. So there was a big study that was published several years ago called the SMILES trial, which actually found that patients who included more of a Mediterranean type diet had better outcomes when it came to improvements in depression. Okay. And some of the nutrients to consider would be the omega-3 fatty acids that are commonly found in oily fish like salmon, mackerel, and tuna. You want to think about the dark leafy greens that can actually serve as some of the precursors to neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine that are important for mental health. And another one that isn't necessarily part of the Mediterranean diet per se, but it's a nutrient that I love, is something called L-theanine, which is an amino acid that is found naturally in green tea and black tea. Some people choose to take it as a supplement. It's been studied in supplement form, and it's been found to actually reduce mild forms of anxiety.
So you mentioned L-theanine there. That's naturally occurring in teas. You mentioned GABA a little bit earlier, and these are now showing up in supplements, right? These wellness supplements. And I think that that's something else that's kind of a new frontier where people are trying to sort of hack this. How do I help relieve some of this daily tension and anxiety? And how do I get into that parasympathetic state that we were talking about?
Right.
But if we can get there through natural whole foods, we get all the benefits of eating those natural whole foods as well, right?
Right. And it's important to realize that you don't have to, because some people may feel intimidated by this. They're like, oh my God, I have to, revamp my entire diet. I can't ever enjoy a slice of pizza ever again in my entire life, right? I mean, that's not what I'm saying, right? So the idea is that you want to make your diet more Mediterranean-ish, I should say. And in the book, I talk about research that has been conducted around the Mediterranean food score that can actually guide readers for how they might go about doing that.
Sure. And I would encourage folks that are thinking about changing their diet. And we typically do talk a lot about this, making small changes, right? Don't try and boil the ocean, because that's probably not going to last. While your motivation is high, you're probably going to, okay, I'm throwing all this junk food away and I'm buying salmon and kale and that's what I'm eating for the rest of my life. And that's pretty drastic and good for you if that becomes a lifelong habit, but it's not likely to. Whereas if you say, you know what, I haven't eaten fish in months. Let me just bring home some fish and go online and see if I can find a recipe that's palatable to me. And okay, my goal is I'm going to do this once a week. And these small steps done over time can have a large impact. And that allows you to, as opposed to this being a novel thing, something that you just do, start to incorporate into your life and it becomes a habit. And then, okay, and now I'm doing fish once a week. What else can I do? Oh, you know what? Maybe I'll swap out some of these other vegetable oils and start trying to use more olive oil, for example. Yeah. So love that. And I love that you kind of start out with the food. It's the anti-inflammatory foods, right? So if we're avoiding the sugars and the vegetable oils and the ultra processed foods, things that people probably know innately aren't great for them, doesn't mean eliminating them. It just means maybe if those are treats or that's the 10% or 20% of what you're eating and you're focusing more on these whole foods, that's going to help my mental health as well as it is certainly going to help your biological health, right?
I mean, it has all around benefits. And so that's what's important for people to keep in mind.
Okay. Last pillar is moving your body for your mind.
Yes.
So exercise, another one. This is right in my wheelhouse.
Good.
I love it. Talk to us about moving your body. How is that going to help improve my mind?
So there's a really cool study that was published several years ago in the American Journal of Psychiatry that actually showed that people who move their body more, regardless of geographic region and regardless of age, actually had improved outcomes when it came for reducing their risk for developing depression. Okay. Now, what's interesting as well is that even though the American Psychiatric Association doesn't quite yet have recommendations for how much we should be moving or exercising, the European Psychiatric Association does, and that is about 150 minutes of moderate activity exercise a week, which is the same as what the American Heart Association is recommending for cardiovascular health, right? And so, again, moving your body is great, just like nutrition for overall health. And it's important that, we're finding ways, just like nutrition, where we can incorporate more movement. We are not necessarily putting pressure on ourselves to go and get a gym membership or join an expensive, exercise studio, but just finding out how we can move more every day. Maybe that means some stretches in your chair. Maybe that means an evening walk in your neighborhood or walking to your mailbox. How can you move your body more?
100%. And just like nutrition, right? To your point, you don't need to boil the ocean. You don't need to make drastic life changes, because typically we see that like the beginning of the year for most of us, right? In the New Year's resolution, okay, I'm hitting the gym, I'm going hard, and I'm going to clean up my diet, and this is it this year. And we all know what happens in February. The gyms are right back to where they were a couple months before. And what happens is that motivation wears off, right? And we haven't built healthy habits and ingrained these practices into our life. And if you're relying on willpower or motivation or grit, most of us, that's not going to go real far, because your motivation is a very fickle friend and typically doesn't last very long. But if we meet ourselves where we are and approach exercise and I suppose nutrition from a place of self-love, self-care, as opposed to from a place of shame or guilt, or I don't like the way I look and I'm ashamed of my body, or I got this kind of self-loathing dialogue happening in my head, and that's why I'm exercising, that's also probably not going to be a lifelong joyful pursuit for you. But to your point, if you're not doing anything today, well, maybe getting up and taking a small walk might be a great success and something that you can build on over time. So yeah, in the book, you've got a few of your favorite modalities, and you talk about some strategies for moving your body and improving your mental health. So let's see, Dr. Brown, before we wrap up here, talk to us. It seems to me like people could be really good in one of these and maybe not so good in others, or maybe they're good in a couple, and a couple probably resonate with you. Oh yeah, I have a check mark, or not so much on that one. Talk about the interconnectedness of all five of these pillars.
So a resounding theme of today's conversation is start where you can. Again, they all work together, but I don't want anyone to read the book and then close the book, put it down and say, oh, that's too much. I can't do any of that, right? I mean, one of the pillars may really be speaking to you right after you finish the book. Maybe it's nutrition. You're like, okay, this is something that I think I can do, right? And then once you really get into that, maybe sleep is one that speaks to you. And while you've improved your nutrition, you want to start focusing on your sleep. And then once you do that, maybe the spiritual piece is something that you want to add. So, I'd recommend, starting with one of the pillars that really resonates with you and then adding from there.
Yeah, I love that advice. Yeah, start with the one that resonates with you and just start small. Just make small changes and see what happens. See how you feel. You are your own laboratory. You are your own scientist, right? It's a wonderful age of self-experimentation. Well, Dr. Brown, this book is brand new. And folks, again, the name of that book is The Self-Healing Mind, an essential 5-step practice for overcoming anxiety and depression and revitalizing your life. It's out now. You guys can find it wherever you buy books. But before we wrap up here, Dr. Brown, what's next for you?
So, I'm still seeing patients. I'm still writing articles. Hopefully, I'm writing some more books. Again, my mission here is to reach as many people as possible with a positive message about mental health. I think it is so, so, so important. And again, thank you for having me here to have this conversation.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Now, before we go, how can people connect with you? What's the best way for them to connect?
So my website is gregoryscottbrown.com. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter at Gregory S. Brown, MD.
And folks, I'll drop all of that into the show notes and you can find that there. Dr. Brown, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today, sharing your personal story and journey with us, as well as all of your knowledge and your wisdom. I think the work you are doing is so important and so timely, and I encourage you to keep up the great work. And I certainly wish you all the best in all your future endeavors.
Thank you, Kevin, for having me.
Okay, that's our show for today, folks. And again, I'll put the links to everything we talked about in the show notes, and you can find that over at silveredgefitness.com/episode 127. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget I have more resources over at silveredgefree.com. There you'll find my mini guides with all my top tips on nutrition, exercise, and lifestyle. So feel free to head over there and download anything that might be helpful to you and your fitness journey. As we wrap up our time together today, you can show your support for this show in 2 important ways. One is to tell a friend about this podcast and encourage them to give it a listen. The second is to give this podcast a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on, and be sure to subscribe and follow so you don't miss any future episodes. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today, and until next time, stay strong.